Hi, Puruesh Chaudhary. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you, Dr. Marcus.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm asking you about future studies and how you got into it and all that sort of stuff. But, can you give us a glimpse of your own position in futures field within Pakistan? Because I know you actually have a kind of profile there. Of course, I could look you up on LinkedIn as anybody else could, but I'd prefer to hear how you see it yourself as an introduction.
In Pakistan, I think so. I did a bit of research to really understand how foresight of futures sort of existed in the country, and I realized that there were a couple of attempts back in late 1960s and 70s in order to bring in this way of thinking
Yeah.
in decision making. And but it sort of frizzled out. It frizzled out in the sense that it never grew organically. Many people were not involved. People from the community weren't involved in the whole discussion.
Yep.
And, and so I started doing it differently. Whereas uh, in my view, participatory foresight is a way to really, encourage people around you to start thinking along those lines, um, so that they embrace uncertainty better than the ones who are fixated over certain decisions, over certain ideas.
Sure.
And so their ability to deal with life um, is far more nuanced
Yeah.
than the ones that are really, I would say, I'm not going to say strong-headed, but I'm going to say that the ideas are really hardwired into their
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
So for them to actually navigate in times of crisis is a little more challenging than for those who have gone through not a whole bunch of training, but at least in some ways have an insight as to what scenarios are, what simulations are, what kind of techniques and methods can one use in order to craft multiple futures.
Yeah.
So that sort of helped me navigate in terms of the foresight and the futures environment in Pakistan.
Thank you. So you were in a government position then, or were you this a private? You'd been commissioned to do a piece of work. Is that what it was?
So I've not, but what I did do is from different political parties. I set up a network of foresight community members. So I had different political parties, representatives,
Yep.
part of the policy council.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I also had professional and expert portfolio engaging different people from the industry.
Yep.
So people who represent the tech industry, people who are professionally engaged in the energy sector, and so on and so forth. And lastly, I thought it was incredibly important to engage the academia and the civil society.
Okay.
And that's where I thought that the interesting mix of bringing these people together, it's rather difficult, it's very challenging.
Yes.
Um, and but it's the way like we were speaking about earlier, like people were curious
Mm.
and they were looking for spaces where open communication and open sharing of ideas could be made possible.
Okay.
And so even when their own fears were being discussed in a manner where nobody's judging them for having them.
That's very hard. If you manage to that's a really a
Yeah.
powerful skill you must have.
So in foresight, I thought this was very important in
Yep.
terms of from what I had learned about individuals that were engaged back in 60s and 70s. And I thought that that was an important element sort of missing from the way
Mm.
they practiced it. And what I also understood from their way of working was they were very narrowly focused on the political dimension.
Yep.
They didn't think in terms of having a very, I mean, like how Millennium Project really puts it, a trans-institutional approach, a transdisciplinary approach.
Yep.
And I thought that was very appealing to me. But how do you bring that into practice? And what sort of tools and instruments one needs to create? I think that was challenging. So the
Okay.
spaces that need to be designed for bringing, such a community together, have them in workshop setting, working together all the time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, yeah, this multi-stakeholder work is, I guess, the physical or human representation of the transdisciplinary in actual fact in some respects, which is, so that's a way of concretizing that more abstract coming together of the different disciplines. Now, as a kid, I remember my dad coming home with this book, Future Shock, right? Alvin
Oh,
Toffler. And he was really excited about it, and they've all both read it, mum and dad. And so that was the very first time I started to think, hey, the future is something that can be studied in some way. What was your moment? Were you walking down the street in Karachi or wherever it is that you live, and suddenly, the epiphany came, being futures? Because I know I got to know you through the Millennium Project first. That was where you first appeared on my radar. And that's a really great project to be involved with. But
yeah.
for you, how was it? Was it a person that you met? A Sahel or someone wandering around in the back streets of Lahore?
No, not at all. I mean, it didn't start off that way. I mean,
No.
it started off like from a very, like when you have like a questioning mind and which is equally curious,
Yep.
um, and therefore you're looking to be inspired and motivated enough to pursue
Yep.
uh, questions. And so I think this is back in, I used to read a lot of research work, but in terms of research work, like what are trends?
Yep.
Uh, I mean, how do
Okay.
you
The
even come
trend.
up? So
Yeah.
what are trends? Like how do
Yeah.
people, how do governments um, uh, put those elements together? And so it started off with looking at different uh, set of policy documents. I was in
Okay.
media back in those days, and so as someone who was in part of the editorial team, it required for me to have a better understanding of
Yep.
what the policy discourse is globally and how it affects Pakistan's local discourse at the same time.
Okay.
And so the bridging tool in order to make that happen were a lot of online material that I came across, but I was lost. So I didn't know how that happened. And I think the first time I was ever exposed to the foresight on the futures was, I think, back in 2009.
Yep.
I didn't even know that the word existed, by the way. Um, uh, so there is an entire approach. And then so I saw this 100 year something. I don't quite remember what it was, but 100 years something about either a country or a specific subject. I stumbled across then Club of Rome website where you learned about how sustainability as a concept sort of was involved,
Mhm.
and 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 then and because prior to that I was looking at different frameworks. So one of the frameworks that captured my attention were the Millennium Development Goals.
Yeah. Yep.
And the Millennium Development Goals, so a mix of all these, and also the vision documents. And so you have a lot of countries sort of come up with their vision documents,
Yep.
and so Pakistan is no exception. And I'm thinking, so you have these multiple. So from the context where I'm in, I was thinking, with all the vision documents you have, how is it that over the last 75 years you've not been able to achieve one of them at least?
Wow.
Or
Yeah.
perhaps you've been poor in communication and weren't able to communicate with your constituency as to how that happens.
Yep.
So there were series of different questions, and that's where um, um, uh, different articles, different books, and then the Millennium Development Goals and World
Yep.
Economic Forum did series of report, and that's where I think I'm not sure was it back then they had a Futures Council
Mm-hmm.
or a Foresight Council.
Yeah.
And I saw like a bunch of people, and so I started reading through the profile, and I was like, okay, this is an area which is interesting. The first formal training that I got was through my master's degree in Geneva, and that's where strategic foresight. And prior to that, it was basically self-learning,
Yeah.
and that was it. Reading enough material on the subject. And then going through this formal training helped me really, and that's how I connected with Jerry, which later moved me on to Sohail's work. And then, and I got really hooked on to the methods and techniques
Yeah.
part of it. And I think that is one of the core features of really studying the future.
Methods.
I do come from a culture which is representative of like numerology plays a huge role, astronomy plays a huge
Yeah.
role, the planetary movements play a huge role in terms of being certain about what are the possible issues or what are the possible opportunities that may arise for a specific person or a country as a whole. So you will see at least in our part of the world, there is a lot of that happening in any
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
But how do you align it in a manner where you get the best of both worlds? And I think the West really was able to develop the tools necessary in order to practice them in the policy area.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's how I got involved with Millennium Project. Even assisting Meta Futures, School of International Futures,
Yeah.
and then looking at different curriculums, how they're designed,
Yeah.
what methodologies are sort of emerging, what are the ones that are essentially dying, and
Yeah.
why are they dying because of technology. But it's very good to sort of really help one get certain questions out of the way. So
Yeah.
it's a way to respond to questions that you would hope your teachers would give, you would hope your decision makers would give. That's a
Mm.
way to answer a lot of questions. That
That,
was that's a personal approach.
no, I mean, everybody gets into this somehow or other. They stumble into it. And of course, the students in the Futures 101, sometimes they've met me or they went to a talk or they heard it on the radio or something that triggers them and they want to know more. And so your personal explanation of the different elements that were needed to constellate is the way I would describe it, to create a point in time when you could quite clearly identify futures and foresight as a valid set of tools, but also as a kind of theoretical basis from which you can move into the kind of work you're doing now. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you been involved with the World Future Study Federation out of interest?
Oh, I think I'm forgetting the university in Riyadh that they actually helped set up a futures research project,
Mm-hmm.
and as a combination of we did some research work
Yep.
on artificial intelligence
Mm-hmm.
and how in our context, in our languages, how does that apply
Yep.
to communities that are, culturally and contextually different from how they are being designed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just looking at those dimensions, we were able to publish three uh, uh, research work. I'll share them with you.
Yes, do that, because I do want to have at least one paper accompany each one of my interviews.
Okay.
So that would be good. You pick the one that you feel the most proud of, or that is the most insightful, and I can include that with this. But I asked about WSFS simply because it's been committed to, I guess, democratizing globally the kind of foresight and futures consciousness that you've been describing in your own personal journey. And it was one of those things that popped through my brain. I thought, I should ask. So would you describe yourself as a futurist?
I would say a futures researcher.
Okay.
And it sort of aligns with the fact that it helps me get a lot of answers to the question that I have, not the questions that I'm being, given.
Yeah.
So it's intrinsically driven, and that's where I think principally the motivation comes from.
So in a sense, you've answered my question, why are you still in futures? Because there's this intrinsic dimension, but it's also something you do in your day job to some extent, isn't it? Am I right?
Yeah, I do that with my students, and sometimes I would do that in my private practice, where I find that clients are open-minded enough to have an outside view of their issues and their crisis situation. And if they're not open, then it's business as usual. I know how to do things, and then I would help you get what you want.
So it's more strategic, in other words.
Yeah. It's more, I wouldn't even call it strategic. No? It's more tactical.
Tactical, okay.
So it's very transactional, right? Like, you're not helping me understand, number one, truly what the challenge is, so that I'll give you a solution that is more sustainable to the outcome that you're looking for.
Okay.
So you have clients who are so fixated on their issues at hand, and they've only been exposed to few solutions that's all they know. And the limitations of knowing that you know it all.
Yes.
That is a challenge that I feel I sort of feel in my private practice. Not so much with the students. Not so much. I do the scenarios work with the students, even though the program dictates otherwise. I would sort of build that into, and that will help them understand it's not a particular future. So the opportunities are abundant. They only have to really look at it that way.
Yeah.
And therefore have the tool to do it. And I feel scenarios is the right tool to actually help them do it, and do it at a personal level, not at a collective level. So I have them do their personal scenario.
Yeah.
And that's they find it very useful. It changes the way that they look at themselves and then look at their future.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I mean, a lot of the work that I do, especially because I'm also a historian, and I work with history students, is on the quality or the function of narrative in our lives, which of course is scenario, and so personal scenarios. Then, do you ever extend it into the ability to put yourself into somebody else's, let's say, a future persona? You're a single mother in this place, and these are the conditions. And so you create a kind of narrative context, but not for that person, but for somebody else. Do you ever help them or push them to stretch outside of those?
I do that.
You do?
I don't look at it in the context of narrative framing.
Yeah.
I look at it in the context of helping them become enough comfortable to embrace the reality of a possible reality, right? And have them see empathy as a tool.
Nice. Yeah.
Rather than giving them any other structure, but see compassion as a tool, see empathy as a tool. And,
Yeah.
and so these are, I feel like, an essential um, um, building blocks
Yeah.
when you do, if I were to say, when you do narrative work, when you do scenarios work, or when you do even simulation exercises for them.
Yeah.
So that's an important feature for them to really be able to comprehend,
Mm.
embrace, and then adapt to
Mm.
those situations. It's quite interesting. I find them very challenged. I find them struggling, and that I feel leads them to have a very nuanced and critical view,
Yeah.
uh, rather than a very narrow, fixated view on things.
Yeah.
What is it like to, what is it like to become, uh, let's say, what is it like to become a flower? What's your life like a flower?
Yeah.
People
Beautiful.
want, you
Ah,
know,
right. Yes, of course.
and so if there's a kid who's a rapper in my class, and I was like, what if the other student became a rapper? How would your life look like in that situation, where you don't have the environment and the condition to help you harness those creative skills?
Mm.
And so, how would you look at
How
that
did he or
situation?
she respond?
One, for them to really embrace an alternate reality. Um, they struggled with coming up with a coherent narrative.
Mm.
So the coherency, and then that's where empathy and compassion comes in.
Mm.
Uh, uh, for instance, I'll give you an example. I teach idea development as a way to really help them personify different characters.
Yeah. Okay.
And so giving them the understanding of how to do it is for instance, how do you become the other person? So there is a lot of interaction. I do that through, like, you don't introduce yourself. So the way I start a class, I'll give you an example. Don't introduce yourself. Get to know a person that you don't know in the class and introduce them.
Yeah.
And he or she introduces you.
Mm-hmm.
And so from the get go, you already take them on a journey of connecting with those that they haven't connected with throughout their semesters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then when you bring in unfamiliarity
Yeah.
in their world,
Yeah.
it's very interesting, And I was like, and these are the set of rules.
Yeah.
No names, no but what are you truly curious about knowing them? And then you move in stages, and that helps them take to personify. So the rapper, they were like, okay, I would look for, so for instance, in their reality, they would be like, I would go to different companies
Yeah.
and ask them to sponsor a gig, things like that. And then you see ideas being exchanged. So a person who didn't think of it, a different person is now thinking about uh, uh, those elements.
Yeah.
Or she comes from a different experience and background.
Yeah.
And so when you see those, and even within the class, I don't know if you experience that, but even within the class, it's not one culture you're dealing with,
No, not at all. Yeah.
and it's not one context. So the complexity of dealing with young minds who intrinsically come from different values, different experiences.
Mm.
I mean, if as a learner myself, I go into that mode where it's a co-learning space.
Yeah.
I'm no longer the teacher there. I'm also a student in the
That's
class.
great. I agree. I totally resonate. Mm.
So I think, having little exercises built within the lecture, that usually helps.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of strategic disorientation that you're talking about. When we get disoriented, we become more vulnerable, which feeds empathy because we no longer have our shield up so much, but it also opens us. And I think you've really described, I think what's at the heart of many of the most effective futures methods that we have is their ways of doing what you're describing. And it's just really encouraging, and it's great to know that you're out there teaching like this, because to me, teaching, as you know, as we all know, can be very box-like. It's, you know, information as opposed to anything else. So I've got a couple more questions I want to ask you, and I'm aware of time. So you know, what were the obstacles that you had to overcome as you were working your way into this field, or was it that long period of trends and all the stuff that you described earlier? Was that it?
I think it depends what the focus was at that time. Let's say the focus in the initial years of doing this was like, okay, why being in Islamabad, I saw a lot of decision making within the Senate, within the Parliament, you know, not having that structured understanding of how things need to come together in order to really take a decision.
Yep.
And so not realize democracy is one form, and then you move beyond it. And that's where public interest comes in, and that's where participation. So I thought a lot of that was missing from a policy discourse. So the initial focus in terms of being in Islamabad is that how do you get the conversations going around them? And as a result, you're aware of it already. We were able to publish 2 State of Future Index as just a policy exercise, and just showcasing how different stakeholders can be brought on one table. They can brainstorm over what are the critical priorities, and it's not necessary that people within institution have all the tools and the means to necessarily implement it. There are people who have other interests in life, and they also can be brought to the table. And so in that context, the only hurdle was, I think, not having a clear idea as to, and you know, to be fair and honest, my language wasn't that easy. The language that I learned in foresight and futures was not something which was palatable in my context.
Okay.
So
culturally, they were misaligned.
It was misaligned because you know, this is what sometimes education also does to you. You know, it gives you along with knowledge, it gives you the language. Apply that knowledge, and when you move back into your context, that's where the true strategic disorientation lies. And so I learned from my mistakes, but then I quickly learned as to you know, how to overcome those. So initially I thought getting these 2 policy discourse documents are way more important than me really correcting myself right now, which was why I was able to do that. And in some sense, you know, sometimes ignorance of the local conditions also work in your favor. Because it gets mischaracterized as arrogance, and therefore you can actually do the things that you want to do.
That's so that turn around. I like that.
I think that worked.
Okay.
And so in that sense, disappointments and frustration as a normal human being one goes through, they were there. I'm no longer disappointed about the fact that, you know, there wasn't a discussion, there isn't a discussion, and I do foresee there will be continuing discussions around this subject.
That's great. Okay, last question. What advice would you have for somebody getting into this futures field now, or foresight field?
Um, I would say, like, rely on the tools, the methods, and the techniques you learn. Rely on the answers that you get from them, but without being convinced that those are the only answers. And so I feel that if students, or if people want to get into this, don't get into this with the notion that there is only a type of future, because you've gotten the answer to the question that you were looking for.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
one method does not justify the answer. In
What I'm
different.
hearing there is critical skepticism.
Oh yes, yes.
I think that's it, because a tool, a method, or whatever generates. It's kind of like a smoothie maker. You put fruit in, and you get a fruit smoothie. Comes out what you put in, type thing, at one level. So to me, then there's some other quality that you're seeking. The answers are just perhaps provocations, and maybe it's kind of like the response, and then you have to take the response back. As anybody who runs a workshop knows, you get a response, and then you ask everybody to reflect on the response, and often then it does all sorts of unexpected and surprising things, right?
It does, yes.
That's great, Puruesh. I really appreciate you giving us this time, sharing your wisdom, insights, and experience, and also that glimpse into how you actually ended up where you are now. I think that's really important to understand, is that people come to something like foresight often off the back of something else that they've been doing, some other kind of work, and they find that they're coming up against some sort of wall or some sort of barrier to. Basically, there's gut instinct that you've got. There's something over there that's missing, and that's what I was hearing a lot in your narrative, is about sort of you're looking at trends, and you're looking at this, that, and the other, and yet there was something missing. So I appreciate that honesty, because sometimes we all like to sort of look like we know exactly what's going on, but as you know, with me, I don't. I mean, there's so much more that I don't know. I'm kind of feeling more comfortable with that over the years, And so I'll bid you farewell now. And, I might drag you back in, especially as this is the first time we've been running this Futures 101. It may be that students actually relate to something you've said in this podcast, and you will come back to you and say, can you clarify that, or can you talk to these three folk, and you and they can work something out. I don't know how it's going to work, because really I'm making it up as I go along, but
that's the best part. That's the best part.
It is the good part, isn't it? So I will stop recording now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mark.